So we finally reached the point in our study where we're coming to what is the most famous chapter in the whole book of Hebrews. The one chapter that most people know about when it comes to the book of Hebrews is Hebrews chapter 11, sometimes called Faith's Hall of Fame. I've heard it called that before. Before we get into this chapter, though, I'd like you to pause the video briefly and just spend some time reflecting on or talking about what is faith? How would you define faith? And especially, what are some misconceptions about what faith really is? Spend some time talking about that. So I want to start with some of the misconceptions about faith, because I found that a lot of people kind of misunderstand what at least biblical faith really looks like, what biblical faith really is. And there's a few different things that I would take note of. First of all, some people believe that biblical faith is somehow blind. That to have faith is to believe without any evidence or really without much reason whatsoever. That faith has to be a blind faith. On the opposite side of that, though, some people believe that there must be a certainty about faith. That faith must have not a shadow of any doubt. Anytime you have a doubt, you no longer have faith, as if doubt is the opposite of faith. Another misconception that's out there is that faith is merely intellectual. That to have faith is simply to believe in some things and to not believe in other things. And so faith is like intellectual assent. I agree to believe in certain things. Now, certainly that's a part of what faith is, but is that all of what faith is? Another, I think, misconception about faith on the other end of this is that faith is primarily sentimental. That faith is about feeling a certain way. And if you feel one way, you're a person of faith. But if you feel a different way, well, then maybe not so much. These are all misconceptions about faith that exist not just outside the church, but even inside the church. And I think Hebrews chapter 11, and frankly, the whole message of the book of Hebrews, challenges these various misconceptions about faith. So Hebrews chapter 11 begins this way. He says, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we don't see. This is what the ancients were commended for." Now, the first thing that we read, and we read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, and it says certainty right there. Faith means being certain. But is Hebrews understanding certainty the way that sometimes we understand certainty? I don't think so. Because when you read the rest of this chapter, what becomes very clear is that these so-called heroes of the faith had their own moments of doubt. These heroes of the faith had their moments of inconsistency, where sometimes they weren't following God as well as they should. So I don't think that faith here equals certainty in the way that we think of certainty. Actually, I think there's a better way to translate chapter 11, verse 1, which is to say that faith is the evidence of things not seen. So as we continue on with Hebrews chapter 11, I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I would encourage you to read the whole chapter. He just gives example after example after example, running the whole scope of the Old Testament, literally from Genesis to the last prophet in the Old Testament, giving various examples of faith. And what I want to do is I just want to derive three broad principles about faith from Hebrews chapter 11. And the first thing that I want to say, and this is going to sound kind of weird or weird at first when you hear it, but faith is about seeing with your ears. Faith is about seeing with your ears. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, if you read all of Hebrews chapter 11, there's a common theme that starts to come about. The theme is looking forward to those things not yet seen. Looking forward to a city whose architect and builder is God. not looking towards the past, not looking towards the country that we've left and wanting to go back there, but actually looking forward in anticipation to the country that God has called us to. There's this common theme that runs throughout the chapter that talks about not seeing with our eyes so much, but seeing with our ears. And what I mean by seeing with our ears is learning to trust the message that we've heard, learning to trust in the promises that we've received. So even as I'm challenged by the things that I see, I remember what I've heard, and that causes me to see my world in a different way. So I see with my ears. Even the very first example of faith that he gives in chapter 11, in verse 3, it says, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." So even in creation itself, we believe that God created everything that is from what was invisible, from what was unseen. So this theme of seeing with your ears, trusting the message that you've heard, is a major theme that runs throughout this chapter. So when I reflect on what does faith mean in my life, one of the things that faith means is I'm willing to trust in the promises of God, even when the events of my life cause me frustration, even when the events of my life cause me maybe even anxiety or weariness. I learn to see with my ears. Number two, the second principle that I derive from this chapter is this, that faith is about an active trust. Faith is an active trust. And both of those words are important. Both active, so faith is not a passive way of believing. Faith is active. We see it in the things that we do. We see it in the things that we say. Faith is active, but faith is also a trust. It's a trust. So it's not blind. Faith isn't blind. Faith is trusting. When I trust someone, I don't have blind faith in them. No, when I trust someone, I have good reasons for that trust. They've shown that they are trustworthy. And so my faith isn't blind, but my faith also isn't certainty. Whenever you trust someone, like if I trust my wife or she trusts me, that doesn't mean I have absolute certainty of what the future is going to hold. It doesn't mean I have absolute certainty of how I'm going to respond in every situation or how she's going to respond in every situation. No, but it does mean that I trust her and that she trusts me because of the experiences that we've shared, because of our history, because we have proven to be trustworthy. And that's what we see all the way through chapter 11. We see from examples like Abraham, Moses, Noah, Rahab, we see this active trust put on display. You think of Abraham. Abraham didn't know where he was going. All he knew was, I've got this life of comfort right now. I'm wealthy, I'm comfortable, and all of a sudden God calls him to leave it all and to go to a land that he'd never been before. And he says, even though I can't see it, I am willing to trust God. I am willing to place my trust in him and to go to some place that I've never been. Noah, same way. He trusted God in an unconventional way when no one had ever seen rain, no one had ever certainly seen a flood, but Noah was willing to see with his ears and to actively trust in a powerful God. And we see this all the way through the chapter. If you look at verses 13 through 16, Hebrews really highlights this point. It says, again, starting verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things that they were promised. They only saw them and welcomed them at a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on the earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. The last thing, the third thing that I'll say, is that faith is diverse. It's diverse in its applications, and it's diverse in its outcomes. I love the example of Isaac in Hebrews chapter 11. Isaac is told that Isaac is faithful simply because he passed on the covenant to the next generation. So he was judged to be faithful just by being a faithful parent. And I kind of like that. You have the example of Noah. You have the example of Moses showing faith in very diverse situations. You have the example of Joseph. Joseph, we know so much about Joseph's life and how much he showed faith at various moments of his life. But the thing that Hebrews chooses to focus on with Joseph is that Joseph was faithful in his funeral plans. When Joseph was facing death, he told his brothers, "Take my body with you when you come into the promised land, because I know that eventually God is going to fulfill that promise. And you better not leave me back here in Egypt." And so one of the things that Hebrews 11 shows us is the diversity that faith, the forms that faith takes in people's lives. And it also shows the diversity in outcomes. The end of Hebrews chapter 11 says, some of these people of faith, they conquered armies, they received their death back to life, their dead back to life. They had great victories. Others, however, had to face death because of their faith. They had to face loss because of their faith. And so there's no guarantees. Hebrews 11 is not making any guarantees that if you just live a faithful life to God, God is going to make your life easy and God's going to make your life happy. That is not the guarantee of faith. The guarantee of faith is that God ultimately will reward those who are faithful to him. But in this life, faith will have a diversity of applications and it will have a diversity of outcomes, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. So one of the things that I think through in my own life is, how is God calling me to be faithful in the unique place that he's placed me? Faith might have a different application in my life than it has in other people's lives. So I need to think through personally, what does faith look like in my own life? He continues on in chapter 12. He says this. I'm going to read the first 3 verses of chapter 12. This might sound familiar to a lot of you. It says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses." Now, this is meant to refer back to Hebrews chapter 11. He's saying, we've got this big family. We've got this big cloud of witnesses cheering us on. The imagery there is athletic imagery, like a runner in an arena. You're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses cheering you on. They've gone before you. They've set the pace. They've set the example. Since you're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, he says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And so from these verses, just to kind of close things out, I think Hebrews says to run this kind of race of faith, you're going to need at least 3 things. The first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need discipline. You're going to need discipline. He says, when this race is hard enough. Leading a life of faith in this world is hard enough. And when we just carry extra baggage with us, we make that race so much harder. And so he says, when you're running this race, throw off the stuff that's holding you back. He says, get rid of the excess weight. The Greek word there literally means body mass. You got to shed weight. If you're going to run this race with perseverance, you got to shed weight. You've got to get rid of those things in your life that are just going to make it harder for you to follow Jesus faithfully. And sometimes those things aren't even necessarily sinful. They're just weights that are holding us back. Habits that we've developed, maybe relationships that we've allowed to happen. Or sometimes he says there's also sin in our lives that hinders us, that holds us back. But if you're going to run this race with perseverance, you've got to adopt discipline to run it well. Anybody can start a marathon. Starting a marathon isn't hard. You're out there, you're running, you're enjoying the fresh air, people are cheering you on. It's maybe even fun to start a marathon. But in order to finish the marathon, you've got to have the right discipline. Secondly, you're going to have the right mindset. You've got to be thinking about this in the right way. He says, run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Hebrews says that the life of faith is going to require perseverance. This is not a short run. This is a long run over a lifetime. He says these people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, they show us that the truly faithful person is still living by faith even as they die. And so we've got to have the right mindset that says, no matter what the temporary circumstances of my life might be saying, I know that faith is for the long haul, that faith requires perseverance. Thirdly, lastly, to run the race with perseverance, we've got to adopt the proper focus. He starts that section by reminding us of this great cloud of witnesses. You've got family. You've got this legacy of people who have come before you and of people who will come after you. And they're all kind of looking at you. They're watching you. They're watching your example of faith. I think of this in my own life. I think of those people who have informed my faith, who have inspired my faith, who have provided for me examples of what the faith-filled life looks like. And honestly, I look at my kids and I look at my students and I look at those people that are following me, and I recognize that to them, I'm modeling what the life of faith can look like. And so this passage helps me to remember that I'm not just running this race alone, that I'm a part of a really big family. And we're running this race together, and I should be inspired and motivated by that. But number two, he says, not only are you surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, you also need to remember to fix your eyes on Jesus. Jesus has run the race before us. He is the author and perfecter of our faith. And if he endured the cross with joy, if he scorned its shame, if he could do that, if he could endure the opposition of sinners, then I can not grow weary and lose heart. I can be motivated by the example that he has set. So as we close out this session, I want you to have a conversation. I want you to think about, what is your legacy of faith? Who are those people who have gone before you that continue to inspire you and motivate you and challenge you? Maybe it's characters from Scripture, like we read about in Hebrews 11. Maybe it's people from your own life, a preacher, a teacher, a youth minister, a parent. Who is inspiring you to run well? What is your legacy of faith? And also, who is watching you as you run your race of faith? And the other thing that I want you to talk about is, I want you to be real honest. What are those things that are keeping you from running this race well? Are there any weights or are there any sins that you need to shed in your life in order to run this race with perseverance?